Welcome back to the LifeWorks LivingWell podcast. I'm continuing my conversation about medical assistance in dying with Dr. Harvey Schipper, professor of medicine and an adjunct professor of law at the University of Toronto. Harvey, thank you so much for sticking around.
My pleasure.
We were talking with Dr. Sonu Gained right before the break about the complexities of medical assistance in dying, and I really wanted to pick up on this legal question, because there's a tension, right, between the healthcare conversation about assisted suicide, medical assistance in dying, that, you know, we have to treat mental illnesses and physical illnesses the exact same, but then it turns out that ignores a whole bunch of evidence. So then you were mentioning people then fall back on the legal argument. At its core, if we strip away all the window dressing, all the fancy arguments that don't hold water for me about mental health equivalence or equity, which I don't think this is an equity issue, it really seems to come down to this legal question and what kind of country we want to be if we want this kind of libertarian death on demand. If people want to die, let them die and help them die. Is that essentially what this boils down to?
Well, I think that's where it's come. Whether the court initially thought about that in that way, I'm not quite sure. I mean, you know, justices aren't prone in Canada to go to the press and talk about how they made their decisions. But let's go back to Carter for a bit. And Carter is based on the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
And actually, sorry, so can you just set the context for the audience what Carter actually was, the Carter decision actually was?
The Carter decision was the decision that, if in a sense, overturned the earlier Rodriguez decision, which said we are not going to allow a physician-assisted euthanasia, or whatever you want to call it. It was physician-assisted suicide in those days. And that was a 5-4 anguished decision by the court. And I actually have had discussions with a couple of the justices of the day about that. And it became a unanimous or decision of the court in Carter, which basically said that the individual right overwhelms the societal obligation to preserve life. And it's built on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, which is quite unique. And if you ask lawyers, international lawyers, why did it advance in Canada? It's because we have this charter. And the charter has many elements, and I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but the two elements in tension here are Section 1 that says we have to establish laws that provide for, if you will, the social comity of the country. We can't allow laws that serve to compromise the integrity of the society. And Section 7 says, that being said, the state has to stay out of individual regulation as much as possible. You have your autonomy, and it is an individual autonomy. Historically, I'm told by people who understand this better than I do, that this really draws from earlier days in the country where, for example, the church in Quebec had a very strong view of autonomy, though they didn't express it that way, and said, wait, we really set the rules of your behavior. And so the court took a very individual view of autonomy, but that's not the only view of autonomy that's out there. And if you look at other cultures, even if you examine other cultures within Canada, they talk about, for example, a relational autonomy. They say people are not individuals isolated from all others and have no connections, no implications to others, and that their behavior has no bearing on others. But the court is
we need each other. We're social animals.
We need each other. And I remember sitting with someone talking about this one day, and they said, look, think about a spider web and the spider. And he says, the spider's not alone. He has all these threads connecting him, her, whatever you call a spider, to the broader community. And as you cut them, suddenly the spider is no more in a kind of way. But we have taken up a very individual view of autonomy. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing. And there was a striking moment during the expert panel discussions when the First Nations community was brought in to meet with some members of the panel. And they were asked, what do you think about all this? And they said, well, we have a diversity of views, but we will tell you that that view of autonomy is not our view of autonomy. It's a very particular view. And what happens in political discussion, as I've learned over the years, is if you listen carefully to parliamentary discussion, Senate discussion, whatever, a lot of people who hold those chairs in the Commons and the Senate, they aren't lawyers, but they say, wait a minute, the court has decided. And they're not prepared to have the discussion. And one of my colleagues in the Senate, who happens to be a senator, says it shuts off discussion all the time. Now you take this and look carefully at the cases around the world, the court cases, which have driven a medically assisted dying, whatever you want to call it, outcome. And these are almost invariably serious neurodegenerative diseases where you're left with an intact brain in a devastated body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the person is clearly either dying anyway or has zero quality of life.
And even in that context, the late Stephen Hawking, who had a disability of some considerable amount, would speak against it. But
we've seen disability advocates speak against this, right? Because it shows that it's so ableist to say that the only way of being is upright and walking and mobile and all that stuff.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. But you look at Susan Rodriguez, and she says, "Look, I won't even be able to take my own life because I can't move my limbs," and the courts and the society sort of accept that. Mm-hmm. And then you take as a given, well, the courts have accepted it. But as it said in Carter, it was in the terms of that circumstance.
Yeah. And they were very explicit about that. Yeah.
They were very explicit about that. And now we're finding ways to expand it. And I've been characterized as a shrill opponent, and I'm not. But what I am saying is, in this fundamental societal cultural change, where it's clear elements of the society actually think differently about some of its fundamental precepts, where you can't define what mental illness is, where you can't measure capacity, then I think we have to go very slowly and cautiously. And we have to learn by experience.
Well, I think the piece that always gets missed is that we agree that people with mental illnesses are suffering, often grievously. Yeah, for sure. I think that opponents or proponents rather of the law accuse others of being stigmatizing and reducing the suffering that people with mental illnesses are experiencing. No, I oppose medical assistance in dying from mental illness alone because I'm a mental health advocate, and I've seen firsthand how routinely and egregiously the system fails people with mental illnesses. So I don't know in your legal experience how much experience you have with the Canada Health Act, but I've made the argument that every province in the country fails to meet the criteria of the Canada Health Act, that's the real concern. That's the lawsuit, that Canada is failing to deliver universal healthcare really at all to people with mental illnesses.
I agree with you. And as it happens, I've had some involvement with adolescent mental health, and some changes are suddenly starting to happen in that realm. But it's a combination of lack of science, lack of understanding, which is what Tom Insel, would speak with as well, and willful ignorance. And then you add to it this libertarian political movement, and you have a pretty toxic brew. And I got involved in this in part after I wrote an op-ed before Carter came out, saying this is a very dangerous slippery slope. And they said, well, it's immoral of you to raise the issue of the Holocaust in Germany. And you forget that that kind of thinking actually didn't originate in Germany. It originated, the Germans actually got the information from the Illinois legislature and Alberta.
And I was going to say Canada was an active proponent of euthanasia.
Yeah. So, to suggest that we're somehow morally elevated beyond that isn't the nature of human nature. But I've been asked, would I ever look to a medical euthanasia for myself? And I say, I don't know.
Sure.
But I would like to know that what is known and available in healthcare is provided, and that this is not simply option number 12 in the cafeteria of choices. This is a last resort kind of thing. I don't think the notion that you often hear put forward that the way to restore people's dignity is by ending their lives is an appropriate rationale for easing suffering.
We're assisting people to die before we actually assist them to live. We're making it harder for them to live, people with mental illnesses, routinely, and then offering them. It almost reminds me of a hostage taker, making somebody's life absolutely miserable and then offering them death as a mercy. Well, no, that's not a mercy. Then you don't contribute to their suffering first, and then we'll see where we are.
And there is a delicious irony that David Shannon, the human rights lawyer in Thunder Bay, points out about all of this in Canada. If someone walks into a doctor's office or encounters a policeman and is clearly suicidal, we have legislation that permits us to incarcerate those people for treatment to prevent their suicide. We form them. Now, we don't call it incarceration. I say that to be a little bit provocative. But we can form the same person who's seen through a different set of eyes at the same moment would qualify for the state ending their lives. Now, how do you reconcile those two diametrically opposed approaches to the same problem when you can't even define what mental illness is?
Right. Well, and I mean, anecdotally, I'll say incarceration isn't far off. Having been there myself, being in a locked ward, they take your shoelaces, they take everything else. You feel like a criminal when you're inside. And this is how we expect people to recover, right? We almost literally incarcerate people and then say, why aren't you happy yet?
Yeah. Well, so there are two pieces to this. I think there are moments when it's right to put people in an institution to protect them from themselves while you seek to help them get better. That second part, we don't do so well.
Right.
But the point I'm making is, at the same moment as we're saying, hey, the guys will come and give you the drugs tomorrow, we're also saying, but, we'll incarcerate you to help you get through this. Yeah. And
now, I want to ask you about one more little piece here, because I don't want to keep you too long, but, you've talked a lot about rights. And people have the right, or at least it's not illegal, to kill yourself in Canada anyway. It was removed from the criminal code in the 70s, as it should be, because suicide is not a crime. It's a public health issue. It's not a crime.
It is a public issue.
Absolutely. So then how does that then implicate the rights of the doctor, right? You have the right to die. I don't think you should, and I'll do everything in my power to continue my mission in suicide prevention. I don't think you need to die, but it's not illegal. However, asking somebody else to end your life, for me, it almost feels like policymakers are trying to sanitize suicide, right? It's cleaner this way. It doesn't jam up traffic. It doesn't stop the subways. It's just so much neater this way. And if that feels so unsavory to me, because I've heard that argument made.
Well, the first thing is that you mentioned is language. And there is no question this act, whatever you want to call it, has been sanitized. And has been sanitized to avoid the public discussion, and I've had that directly from the people who are strong advocates. I mean, you can call it in a kind of progressive sequence murder. You can call it mercy killing. You can call it medical euthanasia. You can call it medical aid in dying. And each step down there changes our perception of exactly the same act.
Yeah.
Which is
at the end of the day, it's a doctor ending your life.
It's somebody actively ending your life.
Right.
So yeah, it has been sanitized, but it's also been built on a confusion that's out there, and a confusion that was striking to me when I first encountered it. And that is the confusion between the right to say, you know, I don't want further treatment. I don't want to be tortured by another marrow transplant or something. Just keep me comfortable. And I have been repeatedly surprised by the number of people who support MAiD, thinking that that's the right they're preserving. And this includes people who are very thoughtful and have been considering this topic for a period of time, and not somebody you just encounter in a room. So there's a huge confusion about it. And political policymakers kind of catch the wind. You know, whether it's wokeism or whether it's McCarthyism, they're overwhelmed by the zeitgeist of the moment, of the feelings of the moment, and and it starts with oversimplification. In McCarthy, we got to get rid of the communists, right? In wokeism, you know, the police are the source of all evil. In this one, God, you know, someone suffering, just end their life. Doesn't that make common sense to you? Right. There's someone writhing in agony, and you can't do anything about it. Give them peace. Look how beautifully they die. You know, yet the palliative care doctors will tell you many people come in contemplating MAiD these days. And then when their needs start to be met, very few of them in the end want that.
Yeah.
I mean, the story
it reminds me of attempt survivors as well, like myself, who attempt and regret it or change their mind. You hear these stories all the time.
Oh yeah, I mean the story that I told in that Globe and Mail piece about 2014 was of a patient at St. Michael's Hospital, where I'm an oncologist, and I was on call for the weekend and hadn't encountered the patient before, and he was a young man who was clearly dying of a malignancy and just anguished. And pain relievers weren't working, but he really wanted to get home. But working out the logistics of getting him home and trying to relieve this pain had become an insurmountable task. And I wandered into the room, not having seen him before, sat on the end of the bed. We chatted for a few minutes. And suddenly he says to me, I want to be with my dog. And I asked 2 or 3 times. I said, you want to be with your dog? Yes. So I went out to the nursing station and said, what are the rules about bringing a dog into the hospital? And they start to look, and I said, don't look. Bring the dog to the hospital. This man's pain is gone. And he died a few days later not requiring more than small doses of pain medication. And that was one of those transcendent moments for me. It's not about the morphine. It's about meeting people's needs where they are. And to see this very commoditized society sort of saying, let's expand this. If people are suffering, that's fine. And as Sonu said, on either side of the decision, you're going to get it wrong. There's nowhere in medicine, nowhere in life where you always get it right. Right? If you forbade assisted dying, there are going to be, with the best of care, a certain number of people who will suffer unconscionably.
Sure.
But the more available you make it, the more likely there are going to be people, as Sonu said earlier, who are going to have their lives ended unnecessarily, prematurely, call it what you will. And when you take away, without really thinking about it, the provisions about end of life being relatively near, or you can't really define mental illness is, but we're going to do this, or even more worrisome, thinking about younger people, who may be allowed to do this because they think at the age of 12 you're cognitively able to sort this out. We're going to make a lot of mistakes.
People, and I hear it all the time, say that they've tried everything. And if you actually go through their case history, sometimes what it turns out is the everything they've tried is probably 6 different medications, maybe inpatient, involuntary hospitalization, but then they're poor and they don't have a job and they have experienced trauma, and there's all these other issues that weren't actually addressed because our system doesn't allow for those kinds of factors to be addressed.
Yeah. So it's not a black and white either or. This is a very difficult, nuanced decision. And as you and I have talked earlier, it's a very difficult one for the public to understand and come to terms with. And you almost need the equivalent of a moment like that young child who was washed up on the Greek beach, for the public to say, this is what this is about. Mm-hmm. Right? It's real. It's very personal. And I have certainly experienced patients whose families have been very relieved that MAiD was provided.
Sure.
And I've also experienced families who've been tortured by it, whether it's a family member who has this thing called MAidism, or whether, as in one case where I got a phone call saying, my husband who's dying, who has no desire to have MAiD, is getting a phone call every couple of days from a MAiD provider saying, "Are you ready for MAiD yet?" To circumstances where the underlying diagnosis that led to MAiD was fundamentally wrong.
Yeah.
And the patient did not have an irreversible condition, and in fact didn't have the condition at all. Yeah. So all I'm saying is, as a humane society, we need to understand deeply this intervention and how it interacts with all sorts of other things. And it may be 10 years, 15 years down the line, as we progress and learn about this, that it expands in ways we are comfortable with, or maybe not. But the point is you got to learn.
Yeah.
And the only way you learn is by asking tough, critical questions along the way. Are we doing it right? What was exactly that case about? That's why how we've advanced all sorts of things in medicine, where, you come up with a new procedure and it seems wonderful. And then you learn its place. And maybe it disappears. Maybe it becomes the dominant treatment. But we're not doing that.
No. But what I will say, though, I think this conversation has been, at least from my point on the mountain, it feels like it is swinging the pendulum back toward a more psychosocial understanding of mental health problems and illnesses. It feels like to me we tacked so far on the biomedical stuff, the brain stuff, and that's good. You have to have that knowledge, of course. But I feel like we went so hard in that direction that it led us to where we are. And now people are really starting to see, because of some of these stories about people requesting death because they can't imagine an income for themselves because of their long COVID, or they're requesting death because they can't find adequate housing. These are real stories that are happening. And now people are really starting to see the living face of this issue and starting to understand it better, I think.
Yeah, and what it's done is shine a light, in a way, like COVID has, at some of the deficiencies in our society.
Yeah.
It's a much, the old, you and I you're too young to remember Marcus Welby, the TV physician, who was the old-fashioned GP with a bag, and in the bag he had very few tricks, but he would come. But he took a very holistic view of things. And even if he could do nothing medically, he didn't have a drug, he knew the family, he was able to bring other forces to bear, and things turned out better. And we've become a very technologic society. So medicine is a whole bunch of technologies, somewhat disconnected from people. The old notion, I'm not going to take a history, I'll feed you through the CT scanner and see what it says. And the feeling that we're not part of a greater community. We've suddenly become supposedly a whole bunch of individuals that are disconnected from the world around us. I mean, when you really think about that autonomy argument, it says, there you are autonomous, you are quite separate from anything else that's around you. Well, we're learning in medicine that we're far less separate from the rest of the world around us. Look at all this thing about the microbiome and how it changes everything from the way chemotherapy drugs work to our thought processes. The bugs in our gut, which you get from your friends or whatever fruit you're having. We are much more integrated into the cosmos, if you will. And to suggest that you can so atomize people and take them as separate widgets, unconnected from anyone else, and make a funny values decision, their life isn't worth it, we agree with you, and then end it. And it has a dirty underside. There was a study, at least two studies now done, saying, what is the financial impact of MAiD in Canada on government finances? I don't know if you've seen them. But the fact of the matter is that Bill C-14, which was the more restricted form of MAiD, was estimated to save between something like $40 and $120 million a year to the public purse. And C7... Which is,
I mean, in my view, that's an inherent conflict of interest for the government to be making this decision when they're motivated to save that much money from the public purse, right?
Well, it's a tiny amount of public spending, but, it plays out in funny ways. All right.
Well, especially when you have the people with severe and persistent mental illnesses in particular are flooding the prison system. More than half of the prison population have mental health problems and illnesses. Emergency rooms, homeless shelters. This bleeds over ever since we failed to deliver on community mental health care. It's bled over into every other system.
Yeah. So back to that notion we talked about earlier about the fence within the fence. What this has really done is exposed a very serious set of questions that need to be answered over time, diligently, to find the right place for this. And the notion to willy-nilly expand it. I often say to people, the Supreme Court decisions are made by people at a time and a place, and some of them look really good in history, and some of them don't. So if you want one that doesn't look good in history, it's the American Dred Scott decision, 150 years ago, which basically said someone who was not white counted as less than a whole person. That was a Supreme Court decision. Right? Come to Canada about 30 some years ago, and there's a decision called Dry Bones. And that Dry Bones decision overturned the Indian Act, which in effect said, you know what? Our First Nations people are equal people. So now we've got Carter, and we've got Rodriguez, and we've got this funny Truchon decision. And how are we going to look at this 40 years from now?
And how many people will die in the interim?
And how many people will die in the interim? And where are we going to be in the interim? And are we going to have the humility to say, you know what? I don't know. I better learn further.
Well, I want to ask you one more thing. I want to ask you one more thing, and then I'll let you go, because I know I'm taking up a lot of your time. You've been very gracious with your time, but I'm just wondering from you, what you think we would need before MAiD. It seems like that seems so far down if you want to treat it as a treatment, that seems so far down the line as a last course. What do we need to actually fix before that? We don't even have universal mental health care. We don't have access in most provinces, to psychotherapy, which is medically necessary, and it works better than medication does for many mental illnesses. So for me, that's one thing. But what for you do you think we need to fix in the system before we can even consider medical assistance in dying solely for a mental illness?
Well, let me turn it around to say, in a sense, that's the bellwether measure in a way, for saying, is our system working adequately? And if we got a lot of people who are saying, I want out of here because my needs aren't being met, when in fact my needs could be met by existing stuff. All right, we're not talking about magical medicine that may come that allows us to live and bicycle to the age of 200. All right, we're saying we know a lot. And to the extent that we're not delivering it, we are driving, among other things, requests for MAiD. When I was very much involved with the World Health Organization in developing palliative care programs and things, I came across a perspective that has stuck with me. And that is, if you, for some reason, stopped all new research, new innovation cold, and simply delivered what we know now, and it didn't matter whether it was in Botswana or Boston, you would cut morbidity and mortality by half.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? That's what this is about.
Yeah.
So improve palliative care, which has to do with how you educate people and who gets to deliver the care. Use technologies to extend medical care. I mean, the pandemic, before the pandemic arrived, the notion of a physician working remotely was anathema to the health insurance schemes. They wouldn't pay for it, and it was worse than that. And all of a sudden, we're delivering all this remote health care. Now, it's going to need to be tuned. There may be excesses in it, but it ain't going away, and it's extended the reach and effectiveness of medicine. I happen to have an Apple Watch. There's a technology that extends medicine. So you use these things, you get them to people. They don't always have to be the hugely expensive interventions, but some of them may be. And another piece of it is to say, in this country, as one of my teachers once said to me, our problem is we turned healthcare into a religion rather than a service. And what we need to do is, rather than think of it as a sunk cost, however much, 20% of our spending in the country is a sunk cost. It's lost on us, and we have to minimize that cost. What you're really wanting to do these days, as some other jurisdictions are doing, is saying healthcare is an economic driver. The best and brightest are in it. This is where powerful innovation comes. This is where jobs come from. There are ways to create a health economy, and there's some, and we're getting a bit off the MAiD topic, but there are some economic thinkers who say, if you actually developed a health economy in Canada, where you fostered innovation, where you sold that innovation, where you delivered that care for a reward globally, because you can do it technologically in many respects, that we could actually have our healthcare system free. So that's really broad pie in the sky thing. And the relationship to MAiD is simply the one that the desire to end your life because your dignity cannot be preserved, because a sense of meaning, of people, place, and person, as Tom Insel would put it, aren't being met. That's a bellwether for our societal failings.
Yeah, the answer isn't to end people's lives, it's to preserve their dignity. Why are we failing to preserve people's dignity?
So for every person who receives MAiD, however appropriately, that's a failing. We either couldn't deliver the care, or maybe the care didn't exist. And the example for me as an oncologist is childhood leukemia. When I started a long time ago, the mortality of childhood leukemia was 95%. And the doctors who were developing the therapies had enormous fights ethically and institutionally in doing it. They were torturing kids who were going to die anyway. Preserve their dignity. Don't stick needles in their spine and all this kind of stuff. And those brave kids and brave parents and brave doctors said, there's a need. I'm not going to simply end people's lives because they're suffering. I got to find a way out of this. Do you know what the survival rate of pediatric leukemia is now? 95%.
Wow.
Didn't happen overnight. And there were bumps on the way. And yes, undoubtedly, some kids and some families suffered more than they would have had they simply been given morphine, euthanized, call it what you will. But that's how we get here.
Yeah.
This is not in praise of suffering. It's saying You relieve suffering by doing better.
Yeah,
Not by
progress
ending
requires
people.
that energy, that friction, I think, to move things
Yeah.
forward, the impetus to move forward.
Yeah.
Well, Harvey, I think we have to leave it there. I could talk to you all day, but I don't think people will listen all day. So thank you very much
And I wouldn't expect or want them to.
Dr.
you
Harvey Schipper, thank you, is a professor of medicine and an adjunct professor of law at the University of Toronto. Thanks again, Harvey. Take care.
All right. You bet.
In our changing world, there is an unchanging principle for success that inspires us. By improving a person's life, we'll improve how they perform at work. We are LifeWorks. We are the world's leading total well-being provider. We are innovators with tech-enabled solutions. Our mission is to improve people's lives by supporting the whole person, their mental, financial, physical, and social well-being. These people are the heart of successful organizations, leading these organizations to a more resilient future and making a real difference in the world and in our communities. Improving lives, improving business. We are LifeWorks.
Well, that's it for us this week on Living Well. Many thanks to all of my guests today, and thanks to you, as always, for listening. Make sure that you like and subscribe to the show wherever you're getting it: YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Audible, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and everywhere else. You can go back and check out all of the episodes from our 3 seasons so far on any of those platforms, as well as at livingwellpod.com. You can connect with me directly on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Mark Hennick. And I stream all the videos from all of the episodes up there, so let me know what you thought about the show in the comments section. If you found it helpful and inspiring, please share the episode with your friends and with your social networks. Thank you so much again for sharing some of your day with me today. I've been your host, Mark Hennick. Until next time, take care and live well.